Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 221, Taking Back Control. After 13 years of fighting in the Low Countries, Maximilian, the newly elected king of the Romans, returns home to a rammed full inbox. There's his cousin, the dissolute Count Sigismund of Tyrol, who is about to sell out the family fortune to the Dukes of Bavaria. The king of Hungary is still occupying Vienna, and there's a new heiress out on the market, Anne of Brittanny. Some of the issues he tackles together with his now seriously elderly father, the Emperor Friedrich III, others are very much his own tasks. In the process, Friedrich creates a structurally new political entity, the Swabian League. Maximilian builds a relationship with Jakob Fugger, the money man who will grease the cogs of the Habsburg Empire. And once again, they fight, one battle after another. And despite tremendous success, this period from 1489 to 1493 ends with some epic humiliation. Not in war, but in love. No man on earth has ever been disgraced as I have been at the hands of the French, is how Maximilian summarised it. Come along and watch as the plot thickens. But before we start, let me just mention that once again, one of us is taking part in University Challenge, the UK version of Quiz Bowl. Being selected to represent your school in this tournament is the highest honour a true nerd can aspire to. So congratulations to a fellow listener, Kai Metchwick, who skillfully captained the Manchester team into the quarter-finals. If you want to watch them, you can do that on the BBC iPlayer. And if you feel like supporting other great nerdy talents by ensuring the continued availability of the gold standard in German history podcasts, as Google's Gemini dubs this show, you can do that by signing up as a patron on historyofthegermans.com/support. And thanks a lot to Michael V., Sergio R.P., Carlo B., Paul V., and Fiona S., who've already done so. And with that, back to the show. Last week, we brought the epic story of the war over the Burgundian succession to its end. 15 years of strife has left the Low Countries a burnt husk of their former splendour. Maximilian may have won the war on points, but he did not leave unscathed. When he returned to the empire for good in 1489, he had just turned 31. He had fought the French and unruly cities for most of his formative years, and he had concluded that his dynasty was in a war for its survival with the French crown and its allies. This was not a medieval war over honor, faith, or territory, but a more modern phenomenon, where either side tried to wipe out the other from the face of the earth. And he had learned that such a war could not be fought with a levy of sworn vassals, but required a modern army, disciplined infantry and artillery. At the time, such armies were only available as mercenary forces offered and operated by war entrepreneurs, and whose only loyalty was to their purse. Money was at the heart of war now, and money was also Maximilian's Achilles heel. At the time Maximilian got engaged to Marie of Burgundy, Dr. Georg Hessler, the Austrian negotiator of the marriage contract, wrote back to Wiener Neustadt that the Low Countries alone could throw up 1.2 million gulden per year. After a decade and a half of war, the number had dropped to maybe 200,000, most of which actually had to go on debt repayments. The duchies of Austria, Styria, and Carinthia were almost entirely occupied by the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, hence there was no revenue to be collected there. The empire itself produced barely 20,000 gulden a year. Now compare that to Maximilian's arch-enemy, the King of France, who collected 4 to 6 million gulden per year in taxes and other revenues. That being said, the House of Habsburg was not entirely without means. There was one member who literally sat on a silver mine. Good old Uncle Sigismund of Tyrol. He is a man who needs no introduction, having made his first appearance 27 episodes ago in number 194, The Fuggers of Augsburg. This prince, as morally bankrupt as he was intellectually impoverished, limped along on well and truly his last leg. He was now 60 years old and had run out of possessions he could sell off or mortgage. For 40 years he had focused on creating an equal number of illegitimate children, frantically building luxurious castles and pleasure palaces, and fighting pointless wars. The last of these wars was a totally avoidable clash with the Republic of Venice, which comprehensively ruined him, even though he actually won. To fund his debauched pastimes, he had relied heavily on his friend, Duke Albrecht IV of Bayern Munich. Albrecht had bribed senior members of Sigismund's entourage and gained an almost complete hold over the increasingly doddery Count of Tyrol. If you remember episode 197, Duke Albrecht's grand plan was to reconsolidate the territory his ancestor, the Emperor Ludwig the Bavarian, had brought together, and that included the Tyrol. And being an excellent steward of his own lands, he had the coin to bankroll whatever madcap ideas Sigismund came up with. As a security for these loans, Sigismund mortgaged his lands to Albrecht. First the county of Burgau, a number of courts, and then for the risible sum of 50,000 gulden, the whole of further Austria. When finally all the peripheral lands were pledged away, Albrecht offered the breathtaking sum of 1,000,000 gulden for the whole of Sigismund's lands, with a clause requiring Sigismund's heirs to pay off the whole sum in one go before the lands would be returned to them. What all that boiled down to was a full takeover of the Habsburg territory outside Austria itself. If Albrecht had been successful, the Wittelsbachs would have become as powerful or even more powerful than the Habsburgs. The Tyrol was not only immensely rich due to the often mentioned silver mines and the Brenner Pass, but it was also strategically crucial. The Tyrol provided the essential land connection between Austria in the east and the ancestral lands on the Upper Rhine and the Low Countries. If the Wittelsbachs could drive a wedge between the two Habsburg territories, the power balance would tilt permanently in their favor. Munich, not Vienna, would have become the imperial capital. This process of gradual encroachment into the Tyrol and further Austria had begun in the 1470s. Albrecht was a patient and a prudent player of the game. But still, he made a bad mistake. In 1486, around the same time the freshly crowned King of the Romans, Maximilian, was showing off the magnificence of the Low Countries to his father, Albrecht bailed out the bankrupt free city of Regensburg and incorporated it into his duchy. He may have thought this was one of the less offensive things he had done to the Habsburgs, but Regensburg would become the sweet mustard his enemies will drown him in. Talking about offending the emperor, Albrecht really knocked it out of the park in 1487. As a frequent visitor to Sigismund's court in Innsbruck, he was introduced to Maximilian's sister Kunigunde. Somehow, the Bavarian accountant Albrecht burned up in passion for the smart and independent Kunigunde. When he asked her father for a hand in marriage, the Emperor Friedrich III had initially been quite positive. Kunigunde, yes, was the apple of his eye, but on the other hand, an alliance with this ambitious and well-regarded prince may come in handy one day. That changed when Friedrich heard about the incorporation of Regensburg into Bavaria. Friedrich had a thing about the rights of the emperor, and removing a free and imperial city from his control was not on. He sent a letter to cousin Sigismund telling him to cancel all negotiations with Albrecht. But Albrecht was undeterred, and he had bribed Sigismund's chancellors, so they intercepted this letter and forged it into another one, a letter in which Friedrich was gracefully consenting to the marriage. Kunigunde, already smitten by the Bavarian's charm, was delighted by her father's alleged consent, and on January 13, 1487, uttered an enthusiastic "yes" in the court chapel of Innsbruck. Now that was the end of the line. Friedrich III issued a harsh imperial order to unwind all the various transactions with the Wittelsbachs, return the lands to the family fortune, and he asked Sigismund to dismiss his corrupt councillors. The Estates of Tyrol very much agreed with Friedrich III and called a meeting in Hall in August 1487. The hapless Sigismund was confronted with a hostile crowd that accused him of causing unnecessary strife with the emperor, disrespecting his wife, and tyranny. He was graciously permitted to accept a sort of temporary retirement, where he handed over the management of his lands to the estates, who in turn would pay his debts and release his property from the Wittelsbachs. All that Sigismund asked for was a generous endowment for his misbegetting of bastards. After that was granted, though never paid, Sigismund, the desolate Count of Tyrol, shuffled off the political stage. He abdicated formally in 1490, and Tyrol passed on to Maximilian, who made Innsbruck his capital. Sigismund died another 3 years later. His last wish was to bathe his hands one last time in the buckets of coins to remind him of his nickname, der Münzreiche, he who is rich in coin. But by then he was so poor he had to borrow the buckets and the coins from a local moneyman. That was not the end of the story, because all these pledged territories had already been handed over to the Bavarians, as was the custom with such credit arrangements. The two Wittelsbach dukes, Albrecht of Bavaria Munich and his cousin Georg of Bavaria Landshut, had no intention of handing over all the territorial gains they had made over the previous decades, and thereby give up all their political ambitions. They weren't even prepared to hand back the city of Regensburg. Now, if the Bavarian dukes had to be forced, the natural tool in Friedrich's hand would have been the imperial ban, followed by a request to the imperial diet to fund the military force needed to execute the ban. But the imperial diet was not a real option at this point. The coronation of Maximilian had kicked off the process of imperial reform for good, and any support from the imperial princes would have required wide-reaching concessions from the emperor, something Friedrich III was not prepared to consider. They could not pursue it as an imperial action. What about funding their own army, using the tons and tons of silver that constantly poured out of the mines of Schwarz? Well, that turned out to be not that easy. The way the mining business worked in the 15th century was roughly as follows. The princes owned the silver in the ground that was part of their regalia, but they usually lacked the money and the expertise to dig it up, so they granted licenses to entrepreneurs who would do, well, all the hard work. Under the terms of the license, the entrepreneur would then be required to sell the silver to the prince at, say, 5 gulden, when the market value was 10 to 12 gulden. The prince could theoretically then sell the silver at market, but they rarely did. They were often so far in debt they needed money right away, so bankers like the Fuggers or Gossenbrot would offer the prince 8 gulden in advance for the silver. Now this delta between 5 and 8 guldens, or effectively 25% of the total value of the silver, came to the prince. The rest, 45%, went to the mining entrepreneurs and 30% to the banker. Sigismund managed to get himself so deep into debt he pledged the bankers not just the right to buy the silver at 8 gulden, but also the 3 gulden he would normally take home himself. Now Friedrich III and Maximilian had 2 options. They could cancel Sigismund's agreements with the bankers, default on the old man's loans, and take the silver and sell it in the open market. That should theoretically bring hundreds of thousands of guldens to the princely purse immediately. But here's the rub. Who would buy the silver ore? The only people who owned smelters to extract the silver from the ore were the other bankers, who had close commercial links across the industry. And they knew that if they took the silver ore, it was only a question of time before the Habsburgs would come to them for a loan, and then some other banker could play the same trick on them. So they would politely decline. You do not think that is how that works? Well, just read up about Den Görtler and his dealings in the Congo. And please use a sensible publication, not the bots. And on top of all that, there was a whole rat's tail of logistical issues, such as where to find the transport for the ore, when all the carts are owned by the bankers, who also maintained the roads, etc., etc. And you still need the mining entrepreneurs who themselves had borrowed from the bankers and could now fear to be cut off from credit. The biggest banker to Sigismund in 1487 was none other than Jakob Fugger. His consortium had lent 150,000 gulden, secured on silver from Schwarz. When they saw Sigismund's star going down, they opened up lines of communication with Maximilian. Maximilian understood that he was in a bind and acknowledged the claims of the Augsburg bankers. But it would still be a while before they started lending at scale to the man who would become their most famous client. In other words, Maximilian Friedrich III may now have princely control over two of the richest lands in Europe, the Low Countries and the Tyrol, but they still had no money and a war to fight. How could that be done? Well, the solution to this problem materialized in the form of the Schwäbischer Bund, the Swabian League. Now, we've encountered these leagues and associations already several times before. There had been a Rhenish League that tried to clean up the robber barons on the Rhine. The League of Constance, we heard, was fighting Charles the Bold, and the most famous and the most enduring one, which was, of course, the Hanse. The Hanse, by the way, never called itself the Hanseatic League because, as you may remember, under the Golden Bull, the free cities of the empire were prohibited from forming such leagues. Nevertheless, leagues appeared regularly throughout the 14th, 15th and 16th century as pressure from the territorial princes mounted. Apart from cities clubbing together to fend off rapacious territorial lords, there were also the associations of imperial knights and counts. These members of the lower and middling aristocracy had the same problem with the overbearing dukes and electors, who were bringing more and more of their class under their direct vassalage. The most famous of these associations of knights was the Society of the Shield of St. George, that had been around on and off since 1406. Both city leagues and knightly associations were usually temporary alliances with modest, if any, organizational structure. This new one, the Swabian League that Friedrich III created in 1488, that was quite different. Firstly, it was an imperial top-down initiative, not a bottom-up one led by knights or cities. Then it brought together two normally not aligned groups, the cities and the knights. And it had actual institutions, the League Council and the foreman of the League. The council was the main decision-making body and it comprised 18 or 21 electors. Day-to-day management of the League was in the hands of the foreman, the Bundeshauptleute. German words always twice as long and thrice as precise. And finally, there was a court of the League to adjudicate disputes between League members. Another major innovation was that the councillors took decision by majority vote, and these decisions were binding on all members. If you remember, the Hansetag, which was itself a very important institution, did not have either majority voting, nor were its decisions binding on the member cities. In the Swabian League, if the councillors decided to go to war, the League went to war. Moreover, the League had gone with the times and deployed trained mercenary armies, rather than a motley assortment of diverse contingents sent by individual members. The cost of this professional army was borne by the members in proportion to their perceived military and economic strength. And not to the old world was that the institutions were split in two and later into three. There was a bench for the 20 Swabian cities who would send one foreman and 9 councillors, and a bench for the 450 plus knights who would again send one foreman and 9 councillors. Further, the League had associated members, namely the Counts of Württemberg, the Markgraf of Baden, the Archbishops of Mainz and Trier, the Markgrafs of Ansbach, and the Count of Tyrol. Now, that was technically still Sigismund, but in reality first the estates and then Maximilian. These associated princes were, at least initially, not full members, and hence excluded from the decision-making process. They were later integrated, but formed just one of the 3 benches, carrying the same weight as either the cities or the knights. Which begs that fundamental question: why would any of the participants be willing to hand over their freedoms to such a rigid institutional structure? Now this again was a sign of the changing times. As we pointed out in episode 197, the success of the Bavarian dukes, first Ludwig of Bavaria Landshut and then Albrecht IV of Bavaria Munich, lay in their ability to provide the basic services of the state, peace and justice. Keeping the roads free of brigands, punishing wrongdoers and building the occasional bridge or road did wonders to the willingness of subjects to pay taxes. That is what their neighbours in the old stem duchy of Swabia noticed, and they wanted a piece of it. In fact, Albrecht of Bavaria Munich was the one who set up the first, much more loosely structured league that maintained peace and justice across most of what is now southern Germany. But by 1488, Albrecht's arrangement had broken down. In part because Albrecht's cousin Georg's rudeness, but also because the ambition of the Wittelsbachs to become the new dominant power in the empire had become too obvious. When Albrecht took over Regensburg, all the free cities in the region and the counts and the imperial knights knew that there were only two choices. They could club together and retain at least part of their autonomy, or be swallowed up by the House of Wittelsbach. That is why they joined. The Swabian League would exist up until 1534, and it was a participant in much of what we will discuss in the upcoming episodes. When the Swabian League was formed in 1488, all its members were ready and raring to have a go at the Wittelsbachs, but the war against Bavaria had to be postponed, since, as we know, at that exact point in time Maximilian was made a prisoner by the mob in Bruges, and Friedrich III had to go north to free his son. But a year later, by 1489, the two monarchs of the empire were back in Tyrol and got to work. The Swabian League mustered an army to regain the lands that Sigismund had passed on to the Wittelsbachs. His cousin Georg caved almost immediately and handed over what he had gained and paid a fine of 36,000 gulden. Albrecht was more persistent. He refused to hand over Regensburg, even tried to hold on to further Austria. Plus he insisted that his wife Kunigunde, after all the sister of Maximilian and daughter of Friedrich III, had a claim on Sigismund's inheritance. The League members were keen on a fight. The emperor was insisting on the return of Regensburg. Two of Albrecht's younger brothers had rebelled, and even an association of Bavarian knights declared a feud against their duke. Now the only one who did not want all-out war against this brother-in-law was Maximilian. Maximilian was more interested in a peaceful resolution, so that he could go after King Matthias of Hungary, who was still sitting pretty in Vienna. So the Bavarian drôle de guerre persisted until 1492, when Albrecht, under pressure from all sides and in view of a League army of 20,000, finally caved. He kept his duchy. Regensburg remained a free imperial city until 1803, but the Wittelsbachs' grand ambitions were smashed. And Lady Fortune once again smiled on Maximilian and Friedrich III. Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary, had died on April 6, 1490. And what was even better, he had died without leaving a legitimate male heir. He had an illegitimate son, John, who he had hoped he could get the Emperor Friedrich III to legitimize, but that never happened, and hence John never took the Hungarian throne. Meaning that when Matthias Hunyadi unexpectedly disappeared, the Kingdom of Hungary found itself without a king, and without a king even the world's most expensive army is vulnerable. Maximilian realized the opportunity, convinced the estates of Tyrol to fund an army of Landsknechte, and by the autumn his forces stood before Vienna. Resistance was only sporadic, and he took the capital, then rushed after the retreating Hungarians into Styria, entered Hungary December 1490. He besieged and plundered the coronation city that I'm afraid I still cannot pronounce, and moved on to Buda. But that is where his momentum stalled. As always, the money had run out and he could no longer pay his men. The winter had turned out to be extremely hard, supplies could not come down the frozen Danube, and the local population, enraged by the plundering hordes of mercenaries, had grown hostile. Maximilian withdrew to Austria to a hero's welcome. Meanwhile, the Hungarian magnates had chosen a new king, Ladislav Jagiello, the man who was already King of Bohemia and whose father, Casimir IV, was King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Just note that within a century, the descendants of Jogaila, the pagan ruler of Lithuania we met in the season on the Teutonic Knights, had founded a dynasty that ruled a vast landmass from the Black Sea to the Baltic. Now Ladislav, the new king of Hungary and Bohemia, was however not the most impressive scion of the family. He was famous for saying, well, to anything his council or senior lord suggested, and the Hungarian nobles joked that yes, he was their king, but they were his lord and master. Ladislav, or more precisely the Hungarian lords, were willing to make peace. So Maximilian acknowledged Ladislav as King of Hungary, but he retained the right to call himself King of Hungary. They signed a treaty of friendship, and for the nth time a Habsburg signed a compact of mutual inheritance. Should one of them, aka Ladislav or Maximilian, die without male offspring, the other descendants would inherit everything. We're nearly there. Only one more contract to go before the Habsburgs can take the Bohemian and Hungarian crowns for real. To sum up, that was some major achievement. Maximilian had regained and consolidated all the Habsburg possessions in one hand for the first time in centuries, and he has added the Low Countries. All that is true, but still, by the winter of 1491, we see our hero seething with anger. Whilst he had been fighting out there in Hungary, the King of France had humiliated him in front of all of Europe. It is these pesky Frenchmen again. You can understand why he really did not like them. When Maximilian left the Low Countries in 1489, the war against the cities and against France was not over by any measure. The fighting would go on for another 3 years until 1492. The reason we lost track of that is simply because Maximilian had passed on the responsibility for that war to Albrecht of Saxony, who was an imperial prince and a very successful war entrepreneur. The Low Countries were, however, not the only theatre of this war. When Maximilian was mustering his army to go into Hungary, he had also pondered an attack on the Franche-Comté and on the Duchy of Burgundy as an alternative. This was all part of his grand plan. You see, Albrecht of Bavaria was not the only one with a grand plan. Maximilian had one too, just grander and more ambitious than his brother-in-law in Munich. But, as the great philosopher Mike Tyson so astutely observed, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Maximilian's grand plan was to encircle the French king from all sides and then gradually squeeze him into submission, if not extinction. To do that, he had been building alliances for more than a decade now. He had established close links to the Spanish monarchs, to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. His relationship with the Tudor King Henry VII of England was wobbly, given his clear Yorkist sympathies, but for now the interest of the two kings was sufficiently aligned so that they would work together. The third main player in this game was the Duke of Brittanny. Brittanny at this point was an independent duchy in the northwestern corner of France, quite a lot larger than the modern-day region of Brittanny. Now, throughout the 100 Years' War, Brittanny, with its Atlantic ports in Saint-Malo, Brest, Lorient and Nantes, had been an important bridgehead for the English and an on-and-off ally of Burgundy. Maximilian had inherited this relationship, and Duke François II of Burgundy had been a major supporter in his constant wars with Louis XI and Charles VIII. In 1488, just when Maximilian was locked up in Bruges, Duke François first lost a decisive battle against the French and then fell off his horse and died. He left behind a daughter, Anne of Brittany, 12 years old, and now suddenly the most desirable heiress in Europe. And who was the man who desired her most, if not the master of dynastic marriages, the great heiress whisperer, Maximilian of Habsburg? He was not only after a chunky piece of real estate, he was after this specific piece of real estate, as it opened up the chance to fight the French on 3 fronts. Now little Anne was quite excited about Maximilian's interest, already seeing herself crowned empress by the Pope in front of an admiring crowd in St. Peter's. Had she listened to the History of the Germans podcast, she might have thought about these things differently. And Maximilian had another advantage over his many rivals, and specifically over Charles VIII of France. He was free and single. Charles was, and I'm sure you have forgotten about it because so did I, but Charles was still, despite all the things that had happened in the meantime, he was still engaged to Maximilian's only daughter, Margaret. Margaret had been dispatched, kidnapped, stolen, whatever you want to call it, by the French after the Peace of Arras in 1482. Margaret had come with an impressive dowry of cities and territories on the western edge of Burgundy, and she had grown up at the French court as the future queen, and was allegedly very content to spend her life with the by no means attractive Charles VIII. Therefore the French party could not offer a crown to little Anne, only marriage to some cousin of the king. Hence when Maximilian sent his embassy to negotiate a potential betrothal, his men were very well received. Discussions were as always protracted, but in the end little Anne and the imperial faction at her court made up their mind. She liked the crown, and they believed Maximilian's promise that the army he was gathering with Tyrolean silver right now was going west to protect her and her lands against French incursions. All was arranged, and Maximilian's friend, the handsome Polheim, married little Anne by proxy. Once again, her princess spent the night with a man who was not her husband, with the lights on and a sword between them. When Maximilian received the news that down in Brittanny everything was shipshape and Bristol fashion, he concluded that he could now take his army to Vienna and leave little Anne for later. But then, news traveled in both directions. Little Anne, who happened to be very young but not very thick, realized that she was not her suitor's number one priority. And Charles VIII realized that his number one priority wasn't the dowry of little Margaret, but the risk that an imperial Brittany armed to the teeth would be sitting in his back. So Charles mustered his forces and set out for Brittany. He knew that nobody was there to stop him. The Spaniards, Ferdinand and Isabella, were busy conquering Granada. The English did not trust Maximilian enough to actually send troops, and Maximilian's army was fighting in Hungary 1,000 miles away. The French took one castle after another, and by the autumn of 1491 they stood before Anne's capital in Rennes. Anne, abandoned by everybody and at risk of losing her land, agreed to meet Charles VIII. The two of them had a long chat, at the end of which they agreed terms. A few days later they met again, this time in the chapel of the castle of Rennes, where they announced their engagement. One can only imagine the expression on the face of the handsome Polheim, who had only weeks earlier spent the night with the Duchess and had been convinced that he had gotten his boss properly married. And such a marriage was still valid, since only a papal dispensation could dissolve such a union. But dispensation or no dispensation, Anne of Brittany married King Charles VIII of France on December 6, 1491, her second king husband, but not her last. Maximilian was apoplectic. He was humiliated, not only because Charles had married who he believed was already his wife, but also because the Frenchman had discarded his daughter Margaret, his fiancée for almost a decade. Maximilian's hatred for the French deepened even further, if that was at all possible. He told everyone that no man on earth has ever been disgraced as he had been at the hands of the French. For the rest of his life he kept a little red book where he noted all the hideous crimes the Valois had committed against him. And then Maximilian did what a mighty lord had to do in this situation. He once again declared war on France. And to fight that war, he once again needed an army. This time he tried to garner support by stirring up public opinion against the French. He had flyers printed shouting that the bride of the King of the Romans had been abducted, and that the honor of the empire was at stake. This attempt at propaganda did, however, not stick. When he asked the imperial princes for help, he received not just the usual "niet," but howls of laughter as they recounted the circumstances of his dishonor. In the end, he gathered some mercenary forces funded by loans backed by Tyrolean silver and at least conquered the Franche-Comté. His forces, however, did not stretch to a conquest of the Duchy of Burgundy, because once again the money ran out. I guess you see the pattern now. In 1493 the two sides finally came to agree a peace. Charles gave up the Franche-Comté, returned Margaret and most of her dowry, and recognized Philip the Handsome as the heir of the Low Countries. In return, Maximilian acknowledged Charles and Anne's marriage and even procured a papal dispensation. The whole affair was so embarrassing that all documents relating to the marriage of Maximilian and Anne were destroyed. The only trace that prove it ever happened was a receipt for 13 gold coins that the handsome Polheim had donated to the Cathedral of Rennes on the occasion of the blessing of the union between Anne and Maximilian. This war with France was finally over. The Habsburg lands were reunited in one hand. It is time for peace and reconstruction. Well, maybe for others, not for Maximilian. For Maximilian, war was not a way to reach a solution. War was the solution. So the next set of wars is just around the corner. But not now, next week. And if you happen to have some silver that has gone up a cool 150% in 2025, why not put some of it to good use? Not hiring mercenary, please. Rather ensuring that this show remains independent advertising free. You know where to go and you know what to do.